Well, thank you so much for joining us today. We are very excited for this new webinar series ICSA is doing called Meet the Author. There are so many authors that are coming to the scene in the cultic studies field, and we are just so excited to highlight people's work who perhaps we haven't connected with before or who are perhaps inactive with our organization. So I'm really excited to welcome Mike King today. Mike is actually from my home state of Utah, or at least he's done a lot of work there. And so I'm especially excited to hear about his work and what is featured in his book. His book is called Deceived, an investigative memoir of the Zion Society cult. And so we are really looking forward to hearing about this book, Mike, and your experiences. So thank you so much again for being here. And thank you, Joe, for interviewing Mike today.
Thank you, Ashlyn. It's great to be here.
Thank you, Ashlyn. Hi, Mike. Good to meet you.
Hi, Joe. It's my pleasure. Thank you for having me on.
Excellent. What I'm going to do here, Mike, is just read something I got off the internet about this society and about the book and your involvement to give us a context. So you might recognize this quote because you're featured in it. It says, in the Zion Society case, approximately 100 people claimed membership in a secret society governed by self-proclaimed prophet Arvin Shreve. Shreve taught that women should be involved sexually with each other and with Shreve, who was considered by them to be their eternal companion. Shreve further taught that the children living in the group were to be sexually involved as well. Shreve taught that he received daily revelation regarding the group's physical, spiritual, and sexual needs. The group lived in 10 neighboring homes. They home taught their children and operated in a, quote, survivalist attitude, unquote, regarding food, storage, etc. Eventually, 12 adults were charged with felony crimes regarding the sexual abuse of children. All 12 were convicted and sentenced. The most serious offenders, Arvin Shreve and Sharon Kapp, are respectively serving 20 years and 10 years to life sentences in the Utah State Prison. Now, Arvin, I understand, died in prison in 2009. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Okay, and your involvement began in this around 1991. But what intrigues me about your story is you got into this as investigating property crime or property problems, and you ended up in this other world. Tell me what you were thinking you were getting into and how that affected you once this opened up into this other bizarre world of cult abuse.
Yeah, Joe, I mean, I came from the largest police department in the county where I was working now in the county attorney's office. I was doing property crimes, and I was actually in the middle of an undercover sting operation. We were buying stolen vehicles and selling them on the street. And I was in the office one particular day, and the receptionist called and said, there's a woman who's been waiting in the office to talk to one of the investigators for some time, and nobody's available. Can you talk to her? And so I assumed that I was going to be walking up, getting some information, and of course, sending her on her way until someone could follow up. As I approached her, she stood, just a delightful young woman in her 20s. She stood and she extended her hand and greeted me, and she said, I've been involved in a cult that's sexually abusing children. Do you have a moment to talk to me? And of course, I tried to act like I hear this every single day, Joe. And I said, well, let's step into my office for a moment. And as we walked back to my office, my mind was racing, as you might guess, 1,000 miles an hour, as I tried to think, how on earth am I going to even begin to ask her a few questions just to get the information we need, knowing that I had never, other than as a patrol officer on the street, investigated sexual crimes against children, or frankly, other than as a responding patrol officer as adults.
Yeah. So you had that interview. How long did that first talk last with that young lady?
You know, I was shocked because number one, I had interviewed enough people. This wasn't my first confession nor my last in my career. And so I was smart enough to make sure that I was covering the legal basis of getting Miranda in place and making sure that it was a nice, comfortable interview situation. But before I knew it, 3 hours had passed and both of us were exhausted. And of course, I'd filled up several cassette tapes back in those days of information. And I said, let's pause for a day and I'm going to find out who we should have help you with this case, and took that opportunity to excuse her, invite her back, and then to slip into the county attorney's office. For some people, a district attorney or the attorney who's responsible for all criminal matters in a larger region. And I slipped into his office and shared with him what I had learned, hoping to offload that. And my response from him was much different than I expected. He assigned me to follow the case.
Well, you opened it up and he figured you were the expert, right?
Well, he knew that I wasn't an expert when it came to child sexual abuse.
I'm just being facetious because, I work with police, but at times I work in a psychiatric hospital in a crisis department, and I'm interacting with police all the time. So sometimes, from what I understand, they get involved, they're told to go for it because everybody else is busy, right?
Yeah, well, that's exactly what happened. And thankfully, everything fell into place, but it was a crash course in understanding the dynamics of not only child sexual abuse and adult mind manipulation, but it was a crash course in cult personality and characteristical behaviors.
And also, there's a cultural backdrop to this. The Latter-day Saint religion, and from this is a maverick group, obviously. So give us a context of, just describe the group. How did it start? What was its purpose? And how did the group view the leader?
Yeah, and I think it's really important to point out that Arvin, this self-proclaimed prophet, was a former member of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. But because he was believing and espousing such bizarre doctrine, including polygamy, which had been, as you know, in the 1890s outlawed in the state at religious levels and at legal levels, but because he refused to fall in line with the church, he was excommunicated or removed from the rolls of the Latter-day Saint faith. So now he was this rogue individual, and he was out trying to build a group of people that would sympathize with his belief system. And of course, he leaned on what he had learned as a Latter-day Saint, but he then prostituted it and turned everything toward what his true motivation was. I mean, this was no prophet. This was a pedophile and a predatory individual who spent the remainder of his life trying to build a religion to, on the outward appearance, justify his actions while he followed his perversions on the inside.
Well, yeah, it's interesting. He without having any kind of governance, he was left to his own devices, and this is what can happen when there's no moderating influence on someone like him. But now he named it the Zion. What does Zion mean to the group? But where does that come from?
We see Zion spoken about in Judaism and in Christianity, and it is a kind of a pinnacle point of goodness, is what maybe is a good example or a good definition of that. And so he then, took, again, like we see these cult leaders do over and again, they take something that's good and pure and whole, and then they just completely destroy the real meaning of it by trying to build then their own passion around it.
Okay. And in terms of the group activity, they lived in proximity, almost like a compound. I think it was 10 homes. Is that correct?
Yeah, in fact, the neighborhood that they moved into had only one street to come in and one street out. It was a rather large neighborhood made up of maybe 30 or 40 homes in this small area surrounded by open fields. And they systematically were buying up homes and trying to take over the neighborhood. At the time we served the raids or served the search warrants in 1991, there were actually 13 homes, 3 that I never knew about until after the event, that were part of the cult. And as they built them, they started fortifying them, and it became this incredible network of activity, especially after hours, as they would move supplies back and forth and remodeling, connecting homes with alarm systems and other kinds of things to provide defense mechanisms for them.
Now, were they armed as well?
So there were allegations that we uncovered in the investigation that suggested that they had a survivalist mentality and that they had been practicing at the range, that they had been stockpiling semi-automatic assault rifles. And so when we served the search warrant, we actually used 70 police officers that morning to hit all of the homes in an incredible show of force, because we were concerned about officer safety and the safety of those individuals and the children inside those homes. What became so amazing to everyone that was there was that the stories were true, that we did recover semi-automatic assault rifles, and they were hidden in secret passages inside the homes and in floors and under rows of carpet. It was really quite remarkable. And then with that survivalist mentality that the homes had stockpiles of food and medicine and even emergency crash carts that they had stolen from medical facilities around town.
Well, that's interesting, because, I mean, that is part of a lot of Christian religion, that there's an end times coming. That's a theme that's been around since the beginning. And Latter-day Saints also have that in their mythology or ideology. But it seems like this guy Shreve.
And I might correct that, because I wondered that as well, Joe. And it really isn't that the Latter-day Saint has this same mindset of the end of the world. It was actually instruction that came from leadership in the Latter-day Saint faith that said, you don't know when you're going to lose your job or something else. You should have a 2-year supply of food and have money in the bank so that when you hit hard times, you're not having to rely on social services or other kinds of things. So it was really quite a laudable plan that, again, because these wacky people take everything to the extreme, they took what I think sounds very intriguing and really the right thing to do, and they turn it into a survivalist.
Right, I understand. Yeah, you're correct. Even that goes back to ancient Jewish times, to put enough away in case of drought or famine. Yeah. So the other thing I wondered is, what were their worships like? Did they have a church building, or did they gather at a certain time of the week or several times a week? How did that go?
This was the other polar opposite of what you would believe. There was never a church worship service. They were required every single morning to read scriptures, and throughout the day to read scriptures. They would get together and pray, but they never held a worship service of any kind. The only worshiping that went on was that the members worshiped Arvin, the leader, which, we see so often in these cults anyway, is this, when you look at organized religion, how everything's kind of outward or upward to God. In these cults, it's toward the leader.
Yeah, I call them hero systems, but not in the sense that the hero is leading people to anything in particular. It basically leads people to themselves when you look at it from the outside. But so Arvin got tried and arrested. How many people in the group were finally convicted? Because I read somewhere there were 750 felony convictions or felony.
Well, yeah, I mean, this is amazing when I go back and try to go through it. At the time that we made the arrests and served the search warrants, we had determined that we had enough to arrest, 6 or 7 adults. By the time we finished interviewing the children that were taken into protective custody, that number rose to where we actually charged 13 people with sexual crimes against children. One of those children in the preliminary hearing failed to be able to testify, so we dropped charges against one individual. And then the remaining 12 people that were charged eventually pled guilty, and they were all sentenced as charged. And so that was really, I think, a pretty remarkable thing, because in reality, when we got to court, we had a 100% conviction rate, which is pretty amazing. Now, we suggested that, according to all of the evidence, that there were as many as 4,000 counts. 4,000, Joe. The 12 people that we charged were responsible for about 757 counts. And it took us 2 years to get those 12 through the court system. And we eventually made a very difficult but conscious decision to stop prosecuting more adults, which we had cases for, because for 2 years we punished these children victims over and over again in a court system, because back then, we forced children to testify.
That's what I was going to ask you, because I was curious how they handled the children, because what ages were they in range in terms of the witnesses, and how did you handle the testimony? Was there counseling going on, or some kind of support to help these kids through this?
We've seen across the United States now this influx of children's justice centers. We had actually just opened the 3rd Children's Justice Center in the United States at that time in our community. And the first cases they handled in that center were these children. So talk about a baptism by fire with such an amazing case. But we quickly learned that the system then of having trained police officers, some trained social workers, was not adequate. And so we quickly elevated that demand to Primary Children's Hospital in Salt Lake City and to the forensic therapists and psychologists that were in place there, because it was just really such a remarkable case.
Yeah. Now, I remember back around that time when the Branch Davidians and the Waco debacle happened in 1993 in April to May. And the children that had survived that or been taken out of that compound they had to figure out how to treat them also. And it was Dr. Bruce Perry who set up some kind of a system to begin to unravel how to handle these kids and how to help them. Was there any cross-referencing between what was going on with your case and that case down there?
No, we really didn't hear from a lot of people. And I think in part, the reason we didn't, our cases stayed pretty much below the radar because everyone pled guilty rather than go to trial. And so that didn't give us the exposure and the attention that otherwise this case should have got, because I mean, you think about it in comparison to other cases across the country, this is among the biggest, most serious sexual cases in the country's history.
Yeah, you're right. And it hasn't been exposed until now. We're getting a better story. But one thing I read, and I think you said this somewhere, that you hope the children that were rescued will not become predators of tomorrow, meaning, we know from some studies that children that are abused grow up to be abusers if they don't have any moderating influences in their life to help change that view. How do you see that? And has anything happened that would prove that to you, that some of these people have gone out to start their own cults or something of that nature?
Yeah, it was really a concern of mine, because that again, my limited understanding of child sexual abuse crimes at that time, which is much different today. I've evolved a lot and I've learned a lot over the course of my career. But that was a concern. The thing that I think has really been interesting in this case is that these children later told me, we didn't even know this was wrong until you told us it was. So their mindset was much different there than many victims of sexual abuse. And yet, even then, because deity had been introduced into the mix, it took most of them a dozen or more years until they finally started realizing how predatory these adults had been on them. Most of them were women, and I think that has also tempered the reoffending kind of a concern that I had. And I would like to hear from you or other experts if it truly is a different risk level for young men or young women to become abusers later in life based on gender.
You know, I've read that could happen, but I don't know of any statistic to say that it will, or the percentage of abused kids that grow up to be predators. I've known some that turn against that kind of behavior, and you know, in other words, their inner nature just doesn't go in that direction. So maybe some of it's genetic, and some of it's depending on who they meet and how they're treated as they grow. I don't think there's any real concrete studies done on that to show that, you know, a certain percentage are going to become predators. I don't. I've known some that have, but that's all I can tell you. So now you appeared on Dr. Phil with some of these women that have now, and this was just recently in October. So tell me about that experience and why they decided to appear and how they handled all of that after all these years, because this is like 30 years later, right?
Yeah, that was a remarkable experience for me. 2 years ago, two of those victims who are now in their 40s reached out to me via email. They didn't know that the other was reaching out, and it's odd that these things happen in the order they do, but it was within 2 weeks of each other. They asked if I would meet with them and help them get their minds wrapped around what happened to them as children. Well, the last thing I wanted to do was revisit this ugly case. Over the last 30 years, I have written this book and tweaked it and then tucked the manuscript away because I just thought this is too ugly and too seedy of a story to tell. And so when those emails came, after a few days, I sent them a very kind note saying thanks, but no thanks, and best wishes in your lives. Yeah. And they were so sweet and accepting, but I couldn't get them out of my mind, Joe. I couldn't stop thinking about them, and I thought, who on earth am I to decide whether they need someone to talk to figure out what happened to him? And if my job then was to rescue him, even though I'm retired now, don't I still have that same obligation to help? And so I started researching, and there were 32 children that we rescued from that cult. And I started looking and emailing, and there were 8 or 9 of them that felt like they had the courage to step forward. And so in about May of this year, I brought them all onto a Zoom call, much like we're having now. And for the first time in 30 years, they saw each other, and they were squealing and laughing and crying. And it was a remarkable experience.
Now, overall, I just wanted to get an idea of how they have adjusted. I mean, do they seem to be doing okay, or have some of them had more psychological problems along the way?
You know, I've spent so much of my career doing analytics that was actually the first thing I did was I created a questionnaire for them about how did they handle their relationships? What kind of relationships have they been through? How are they as parents? If they have children, are they helicopter parents that don't allow their kids to sleep over? And almost to a T, they answered the same way as in regard to the dysfunction that they've experienced throughout their lives as a result of the abuse that they went through. But two things came to the surface that I talk about quite a bit in the book, and I'll just leave it with the fact that they talked about as children homeschooled in a cult, cults do not believe there's a need for education for the most part because the world's coming to an end. So they were denied education. Many of them never got past the third grade. One who was a stripper in Los Angeles and worked in bars her entire life, finally paid another stripper who looks like her to go take the GED just so that she could say she has a GED. And she proudly claims that GED now on her job applications. But they had similar experiences. But the first was lack of education. The second was we really made some terrible mistakes at the government level in 1990, because even though we ordered and paid for, court ordered and paid for counseling for these children, we sent them back to the very parents who put them in this position in the first place with the expectation they were going to follow through. And these children went through their lives without therapy. And so we discovered that there were some things that we really needed to do to continue to help.
Interesting. Wow. This is a powerful story. There's so much involved in this, and you almost need child psychologists to interview you about that part of it. And, and I'm not one, but we're running a little bit short on time. And if you have something you could read to us that you think is significant regarding the book, did you pick anything out at this time?
You know what? I did. And thank you so much for the opportunity to do that. I actually thought I would just read a piece of the first chapter, if that's okay, Joe.
Wonderful. Yeah, go ahead.
July 10, 1991. I heard my office phone ringing down the hall as I stepped out of the municipal building elevator. My workday seemed to be starting without me. As an investigator in the county attorney's office assigned to work property crimes, my days were never quiet. A relentless backload of cases stacked up daily. I rushed to my 7th floor office only to find that I'd missed the call. Taking advantage of that quiet moment, I sat down at my desk and I began making preparations for an upcoming sting operation. My office was generally a hive of activity, with people coming and going and the phone ringing nonstop. Today would be no different. It wasn't long before investigators started filing in and out and the phone began again. I ignored it, hoping the receptionist would take a message. The incessant ringing became increasingly annoying, so I grabbed the receiver and I abruptly answered, "This is King." The caller on the other end was our office receptionist asking me to come to the lobby and to meet with someone. I thought, another interruption to my already busy day. Impatiently, I stepped into the lobby. The receptionist gestured toward a young woman seated in a chair. She said, "Mike, this woman has been waiting to talk to someone for a while. Can you speak with her?" The woman appeared to be in her 20s and was very petite. She was attractive and well-dressed, all in black. Her hair was also black. It was big and stiff with hairspray. She wore plenty of makeup. It was clear that she had spent a lot of time getting ready for the day. She looked up from the magazine she was flipping through and she politely stood to greet me. "My name is Erin Anderson," she said with a slight lisp. "I need to talk to somebody about a cult that I've been a member of that's sexually abusing children. Do you have a moment to talk to me?"
Oh my.
Well, the air seemed to leave the room. did I hear her correctly? Did this woman just confess to sexually abusing children?
Oh, my word. Yeah. Yeah. So this is an emotional case for you back then, because I can tell even now when you appeared on Dr. Phil, you got tearful when he introduced it. To have those women there and coming together in public like this, I mean, that's a huge event, a big step forward emotionally, you know, and how you present yourself to the world is how you have to react to it. So, you know, at this point, how much are you involved in their personal lives? I mean, is there conferences, you know, is there discussions going on? Do they share with you what therapy they're going through? I'm just curious to see how deeply you got involved in this.
You know, it's interesting because I feel like an uncle that found a couple of nieces that I had long forgotten about. And we do keep in touch now. Again, only 8 or 9, and one is actually secondhand all the time. We're willing to come forward and be identified and be on the Dr. Phil show, and others, the others are still putting this together in ways that they can. For some, it means ignoring that it ever happened, and others, it's just too painful to talk about. But I have on a regular basis contact with these wonderful women, and I hear about the challenges they're facing in their personal lives. I look forward to showing up if they ever graduate from college, or if they ever want me to do something. And I am grateful. One of them the other day sent me just a little note that said, "You have been more of a father to me than my own father, who allowed me to be abused," you know. And so that after 30 years, you know, cops go through a lot of emotion themselves when they deal with these kinds of cases. So it's been gratifying from that perspective too. And of course, to walk on the stage and see those kids after 30 years, because in my mind, they're still 12, 13, 14, 15-year-old kids. I could see their little faces inside those mature faces now. And it was a remarkable experience.
Incredible. So one last question here, or maybe one of them. What kind of support do you have? I mean, how are you supported in this venture? Because it can be a lonely thing writing a book about this kind of thing, and you get some attention because of its eccentricity and you know how fantastic it is. But do you have personal support with this project and going forward?
Yeah, you know, I actually had 2 experiences in my life that made this a bearable experience. And there will always be, I think, scabs and scars for any investigator that handles cases like this. But the first came when I was a brand new employee in a psych unit at the local hospital as I was finishing up college. And a man committed suicide in front of me, and I was really disturbed by that experience. And I remember the psychiatrist, Dr. Clark Summers, taking me aside and saying, "It's imperative that you learn how to not let their pain become your pain." And I spent a lot of time kind of working through that I can be a champion, I can support, I can love, I can care for, but I can't carry. And so I've been able to do that. But the only reason I've been able to do it is because I also have a faith tradition, and I went and sought out leadership in my church and got counseling that helped me also realize that there are greater powers that carry the weight. And so my job is just to work my tail off and try to give them the best representation that the people who should have given them never did.
Wonderful. Then the last question, what kind of blowback have you received from the group itself? I mean, did you get negative reactions, or did that more or less just die away once they were arrested?
Oh, no, there were, in fact, in the book, I talk about how even from prison, there were attempts to try to slow me down, to discredit me, to shut down the investigation. those same attempts went after the children to try to discredit them. And that's been an interesting thing as I've thought about even exposing all of this case 30 years later. And I think what's happened in my mind is that I've realized that these adults, they also were duped by this self-proclaimed prophet. And I can only hope and pray that those experiences that they went through, the rehabilitation process, the prison process, that all of that helped them to get clarity of mind. Now, many of them went on and joined other polygamous groups and other kinds of things. So it didn't change their mindset, but hopefully it became a consensual adult relationship rather than involving children. And I worry every day, even about this, that they have made choices to get on with their life. And the reason I thought it was so important in this book to talk about them was to remind people that it's not the mentally deficient who fall prey to cults. It is people who seem to, and in many cases do have much of their life together, but these cult leaders are so skilled at finding the chink in our armor or their armor that they can somehow convince them and slowly boil them to the point that they'll commit crime themselves.
Yeah, back in the 19th century, they called these characters confidence men, and the idea of con man comes out of that. So they gain your trust, and you feel comfortable with their initial rap or whatever it is they're selling, and before you know it, you've been hijacked. They call them trust bandits. But the important thing here is that I think that to the credit of these people, they trusted. That's a normal human function. We need it to function in society, but that gets taken advantage of. Anyway, I'll stop my speech right there. But do you have any last things to say? Because we're kind of running short on time, and I don't want Ashlyn to have to edit too much of this. So
I wish I could just spend another half hour interviewing you, because I just think it's so important that people understand. I always look back at that Maslow hierarchy of needs, and I think how basic that is, and yet how absolutely accurate it continues to be. That we can't teach people how to self-actualize when their bellies are hungry or they don't feel safe. And these leaders love to bring them in and promise them that God's going to make them something great. And wow, people will abandon a lot for that.
Yeah, it's kind of Maslow's hierarchy of needs upside down, because the self-actualization is the bait. And so you're at the peak wanting that experience of being with God. And then they build the rest downwards until the point where you're totally submissive. It's one way to look at it, I think.
That is really intriguing. I like that actually a lot. Yeah.
You can use that if you want to.
Thank you. I will. I won't claim it, but I'll tell them where it came from.
Actually, I never heard it before. I just thought it up.
Well, it's actually very interesting though, isn't it? Yeah. Because they have so little underneath, and yet they take them right to the top and promise them everything.
Yeah, that's
amazing.
The transcendent experience, and then they tell you, well, you're not ready to get there yet, so let's start down here, and we'll bring you up to this thing that's already set. The goal is set, and the goal, of course, is always do what the leader says, because he's the funnel of God, or the example of God on earth.
But thank you so much, Mike, for interviewing with us today. I just so appreciate learning more about your story. It hits home with me just from my own personal experiences with polygamous communities out in Utah. So thank you so much for your work. Thank you, Joe, for interviewing today.
Yeah, it was a pleasure. It was good to meet you, Mike.
Yes, my pleasure. Thank you to both of you.
I hope we can talk again
I look
sometime.
forward to seeing it.
Thank you so much.